All right. Well, it is my great pleasure to introduce Christo Wilson, not only my colleague, also my friend and neighbor. He is an associate professor in Khoury College of Computer Science at Northeastern, also a member of our Cybersecurity and Privacy Institute, and also an associate dean for the undergrad programs here. His research focuses on online security and privacy with a specific interest in algorithmic auditing. His work is supported by a very long list of entities, including the National Science Foundation, Sloan Fellowship, Mozilla Foundation, Knight Foundation. If I kept reading this, you wouldn't have enough time to give his talk. Also the recipient of numerous paper awards and cease and desist letters, all proudly displayed in his office. Not the one that's behind you, though. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Christo. Take it away.
Well, thank you all for hosting me. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been watching the work that this group has been doing for years, vicariously through Dave. I mean, I love you all. Definitely of the same mindset about these things, like measurements, using that for informed policy, trying to improve privacy. So today I want to talk about algorithm auditing, whatever that means. This is something that I've been doing for a long time, possibly before the word or the phrase even existed. It's something that I came to much later, but it seems to be important now. It's now a word that gets thrown around by regulators and policymakers. So let's talk about it. Where's my focus? There we go. So yeah, if you've been following the news, you're probably aware of these hearings in the House and the Senate where tech CEOs get hauled up in front of Congress and they get grilled about this parade of evils that are attributed to their platforms. You've got Sundar Pichai, like Google search is not polarizing the electorate. It's not creating these filter bubbles that sort of shunt people into partisan bubbles and affect voting outcomes in this country. Right? You got Mark Zuckerberg. Instagram does not harm the mental health of children or young women. Right? In the wake of things like the Frances Haugen revelations, former Twitter, now X, whatever. Twitter does not censor conservative voices. This is a long-standing accusation that cuts across the social media platforms that their content moderation systems, their content curation systems are systematically disadvantaging one political group over another. Again, back to Sundar, right? Google does not facilitate discriminatory advertising. These accusations go back to work that was done by LaTanya Sweeney many years ago. This also cuts across other platforms, things like Facebook. Are these systems explicitly allowing advertisers to discriminate, or are they sort of implicitly discriminating by their very design? Right, back to Facebook. Facebook did not harm public health during the COVID-19 pandemic, right? A lot of concerns about the spread and promotion of misinformation. Right, and a newcomer to the group, CEO of TikTok, Shuo Chu, right? TikTok does not spread government propaganda. Again, this idea that the system is sort of opaque. It has this assumed to be nefarious foreign ownership, and maybe they're using that to spread content that's in support of the Chinese Communist Party without anyone's knowledge. So, on one hand, these hearings are a dumpster fire. Right? I don't think there are any real substantive positive outcomes that have come from these things, but I bring them up because I think they're sort of amazing that they occurred at all. Right? The idea that algorithms on websites and apps are so troubling and so powerful that it rises to the level of congressional scrutiny and the national conversation. If you had told me that was going to happen in, I don't know, 1995, when I first got my broadband connection, I would have laughed in your face. Like that just doesn't seem like the future we were heading to. But we are very much in that future now. So, the upshot here is that algorithms really run our lives. Especially if you live in, a developed country, you pretty much are online all the time. The systems that you're interacting with have these kinds of properties, and they matter, right? If you're looking at any sort of media, right, algorithms are sorting it, filtering it, ranking it, personalizing it. Your experience is heavily curated and potentially totally divergent from other people's experiences. Right? Targeted ads, again, lots of data driven by machine learning, right? The opportunities that you're offered or the ways in which you're targeted in things that you could be vulnerable in, right? All driven by algorithms. Increasingly, there's these startups that are evaluating you for things like jobs, promotion, creditworthiness, whether you are eligible for social programs or even medical care. These are decisions that used to be made by human beings that are now automated, again, using data and things like machine learning. Algorithms manage your work, right? If you are a gig employee, your boss is the computer. And then, as we start getting into this brave new world of generative AI, right, we're talking about algorithms that are going to be generating our content and effectively our culture, right? It's no longer human beings deciding what should be in a show or a song, right? It's all algorithmically produced. So, on one hand, these things are not inherently bad. The idea that we have a whole internet's worth of information and we need algorithms to help us find the things that are relevant is sort of wonderful, right? We live in a saturated information space where you can find anything you want at any given time. But on the other hand, these systems lack transparency, and that's what then raises these kind of concerns that then bubble up to Congress. So, when I think about these kinds of systems, I think about information asymmetry. They're data-driven, and data about us, about social processes, that kind of stuff is plentiful. Arguably, the companies know a lot about us. But the reverse is not true. Right? We don't know a lot about these systems, right? The data that drives them, how they're constructed, what objectives they're tuned for. Largely, these systems are black boxes. So, classically, we would say that something like sunlight is potentially a disinfectant, right? If you bring transparency to these systems, that can inform the stakeholders, right? That could be the public, that could be regulators. So we can have a discussion about the form and the shape of these things, the influence they may have. Hopefully, if you do this right and you have transparency, that promotes accountability, right? You can no longer hide bad practices, discriminatory practices, self-preferencing, this kind of litany of evils. And then as I'll sort of show, if you have transparency, hopefully that lets us focus on real problems for reform. I'll talk about a couple of examples in a few minutes, but a lot of these hearings have touched on potentially consequential issues that I don't actually think are issues in practice. Right? The system is a black box. People assume it has a problem, but it doesn't. So getting to the heart of those matters and figuring out what is a real problem versus an illusory problem, that helps us focus on the things that matter. So, that brings us to this idea of an algorithm audit. When I started doing this work a long time ago, our idea was you can use experimental techniques to try and peel back the curtain, use them to investigate a black box system, learn how it works inside without any sort of privileged access. Now, we can talk about this a little bit later. The term algorithm audit, I think, is now being applied in a number of other contexts that are a little different. People talk about formalized auditing procedures for AI that involve like a certified auditor or red team. That may be a good thing, but it's not what I'm going to be talking about today. So what can we learn from algorithm audits? So I want to spend a little bit of time going through some recent work that has come out of my lab with various collaborators, looking at different kinds of systems and different kinds of problems and what we can learn through auditing. So I'll talk about filter bubbles in search, I'll talk a little bit about radicalization on social media, and then I will very briefly touch on unfair bias in hiring systems. I do have the chat open, so if people have questions, feel free to post, or if you put up the little Zoom hand, hopefully I will notice you and I can stop and page you in. I very much like interactivity, so if you want to ask a question, go for it. Alternatively, hopefully we'll have time at the end and you guys can grill me. Okay, Google search. Right, if you go on Google and you search for something like breaking news, they will probably show you a bunch of links to breaking news articles from a variety of different sources. I've sort of grouped those sources here on a spectrum from left to right based on their political valence. Right? On the far left, you have something like Mother Jones. On the far right, you have straight up misinformation like InfoWars. In the middle, you have something like the Wall Street Journal. Now, of course, Google can't show you everything that exists, right? There's way too much. So Google has to curate. So maybe on the first page of the search results, Google only shows you a subset of breaking news articles drawn from this sort of centrist set of articles. So let's imagine that you click on one. You click on a link to an article from The Guardian. Now, it is well known that Google search is personalized. So in theory, right, Google is looking at your queries and your engagement with links, what you click on, to then inform the way it presents information to you in the future. So let's imagine that you go back to Google, you search for breaking news again. Based on your prior search activity, Google might infer something about you as an individual. Right? You clicked on The Guardian. The Guardian is somewhat left-leaning. This time, maybe Google presents information to you that is, in general, more left-leaning. Now, let's imagine that you click on a link to The Atlantic. The Atlantic is a pretty liberal outlet. So the next time you go to Google search, you type in breaking news, right? This process may continue, right? The results now get even more heavily personalized because they have even more data about your preferences, saying that you appreciate content that is left-leaning. So the idea that this kind of personalization could be bad for you is attributed to Eli Pariser. So he's a sociologist. He wrote a book about this. He calls the phenomenon the filter bubble. So the book is really interesting. I read it many years ago. It was really a formative experience for me. As a computer scientist, intuitively, I understood how to engineer a system that would be personalized this way. But the idea that it could have a harmful social effect was actually quite eye-opening for me. So in the book, Eli Pariser argues that this kind of personalization is harmful. If you segregate people into these distinct information bubbles, it creates a sort of feedback loop, right? Pushing you towards content that is more and more aligned with your own beliefs, eventually, potentially even shaping your beliefs and pushing them further to political extremes. So that's harmful in that it may increase polarization in general. But this is also harmful in that it can kind of erode a shared space of information. If the information that I see as like a liberal is just completely and fundamentally different than the information you see as a conservative, how can we speak in the same terms about consequential issues? Right? We sort of lack a shared set of facts, a shared language to discuss. So again, Eli wrote a whole book about this. Google has always said, this is not a thing, right? We don't cause filter bubbles. But one thing that struck me about the book is that there's no evidence, right? He's a sociologist. He proposes this theory, but he didn't measure Google or any other search engine. He just posits that this could happen and that if it was, it would be harmful. So to me, as an empirical researcher, this is something I can tackle. Is Google actually making filter bubbles? So this is a topic that we have been looking at for years. So I'll tell you about the most recent study we did on this. So this study began when we recruited people to join a participant pool. We did this in 2018. We got about 260 people. We did it again in 2020. We got about 450 people. Those people were asked to complete a demographic and political orientation survey, so we know a little bit about them. But crucially, they were also asked to install a browser extension. So the browser extension let us surveil them for about 6 months. So we had a full record of their web browsing activity, so all the URLs they visited. But then whenever they went to Google, we also scraped the search results. So what did they query, and exactly what were they shown by Google? If they click on a link, right, we get that too. So using this kind of data set, we can start to explore this question of, is Google making filter bubbles? Right? We know people's political orientation, we know what they're searching for, we know what they're being shown, we know what they're clicking on. Based on that, you can start to disentangle, what are people being shown? Is it kind of driving them towards polarized extremes? As I'll show you in a minute, this study relies on a little bit of additional contextual metadata. So one of the things that we use heavily is a partisanship scoring system for web domains. So if you pick a domain like CNN, what is its partisan lean from -1 to 1, where -1 is ultra liberal, 1 is ultra conservative, and 0 is roughly centrist. If you're interested, I can tell you how we did that. Yeah, Zabir.
Can you define maybe filter bubbles a little bit more precisely? Is it just the algorithms showing personalized recommendations which are leaning in certain way, or how users react to them, or some combination thereof?
Yeah, so when I use the term filter bubble, I'm really just focused on the impact of the algorithm. So the algorithm is showing things at some kind of partisan extremity. I'm not talking about people's own proclivity to choose content that aligns with their beliefs. As we're going to see in just a second, like that's actually a very different phenomenon.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have this partisanship system for scoring web domains. The other thing that we rely on is a list of domains that are known to spread unreliable or fake news. This is derived from things like NewsGuard and some other prior work. Okay, so let me walk you through the data a little bit to show you kind of what we're going to be analyzing. Let's assume we have one of our participants, call them participant 8. Let's assume that this person took the demographic survey and they've said that they are somewhat liberal. So I'm color coding them in blue. Based on the browser extension, we have their browsing history. So there's this list of the URLs that they've browsed over time, and I've color coded them by partisanship. So they started on a domain that was sort of blue, then they went to one that was sort of neutral, and then some other ones that were left-leaning, one that was right-leaning, etc. Right? This is just the browsing history. Right? At some point, they go to Google search, and there we get additional data. So we have a copy of the query as well as all of the links that they were presented. Right? So let's say there were 4 links, 2 of them were sort of neutral, 1 was left-leaning, 1 was right-leaning. We know which one the person clicked on, right? So that's, again, part of the browsing history. And then the person keeps browsing around the web, and it all gets coded by partisanship. Given this kind of data, what do we want to look at? So the first thing we can look at is the Google exposure, right? So this is, Google's algorithm choosing to show you things that are more neutral or more left-leaning or more right-leaning. This really gets at the filter bubble piece of it, right? What Google chose to show. But then there's also the factor of engagement, right? Of the options you are presented, which did you choose to click on? So this gets to the element of personal choice. And then there's the overall context, right? Forget about Google for a moment. This person does stuff on the web. Do they tend to go places that are left-leaning or right-leaning or more neutral? So this, again, speaks to kind of the person's broader proclivities. Like, in the absence of something like Google, what would they have done in general? So I can present some of the analysis of this data to you. So on the left, we're going to be looking at the partisanship of the websites that people were visiting. So this again is from -1 to 1, liberal to conservative. On the right, we're going to be looking at the fraction of unreliable news, right? So this is like they went to a misinformation provider, basically. And this top row of data is all from 2018. So starting with the top cluster, this is the exposure on Google search. So focusing just on the left for a moment, what you see is that the points for the strong Democrats, the strong Republicans, and the independents in the sample are all sort of clustered. They're basically all within kind of the standard deviation there. So we would say that there isn't really obvious separation in terms of Google exposure. It's not like Google is showing super left-leaning stuff to the strong Democrats and super right-leaning stuff to the strong Republicans. It doesn't really seem like there's a strong filter bubble effect here. Now, in terms of unreliable news, it does seem like strong Republicans are getting somewhat more fake news exposure through Google. But again, the error bars here are pretty wide. The underlying distribution is pretty skewed. There's a few people in the panel who actually consumed a lot of fake news. They tended to be strong Republicans. They tended to be older. But in general, there's a lot of skew there. So moving to the second grouping, right? This is follows from Google search. So what did you click on? Here you start to see the separation increase a little bit in terms of partisanship, right? There's a little bit more of a distinction now between the strong Republicans versus the independents and the Democrats. So this is not really a filter bubble thing, right? People are in general being presented with the same range of news content, but people, especially the strong Republicans, are choosing to engage with content that aligns with their position a little bit more. Right. Finally, we look at overall engagement, so just like everything you did on the web. In terms of partisanship, now there is very clear separation. Strong Democrats tend to engage with websites that are slightly left-leaning. Strong Republicans now are mostly engaging with websites that are fairly right-leaning. And then independents are sort of in the middle. You also see that the proportion of unreliable news keeps going up for the strong Republican group. So this is a finding that's been observed in other studies as well. The consumption of misinformation and fake news is not even across the political spectrum. It tends to be older Republicans who are engaging with this content. Now, what's remarkable is we did all this again in 2020, and the results don't really change. It looks like the amount of unreliable news that people were exposed to on Google went way down. So perhaps their content moderation policies in general got a little bit better. But you still see, in terms of overall engagement, clear separation between the groups, strong Republicans engaging with more misinformation. But again, there's no filter bubble here. So one thing I'll note with these results is that this is not controlling for people's queries. There's additional results in the paper where we actually do that. So we do some NLP stuff to try to control for people who are explicitly using partisan terms when they search. And that actually causes the exposure numbers to group even tighter. So there's a little bit of an effect here from people choose the language they use when they search, but even that doesn't create sort of massive separation. Yeah, Kostas.
Yeah. So do you follow in shorter periods over time what might be going on, or you got a snapshot in 2018 and a snapshot in 2020? Meaning, do you have like over a week, over the next 20 interactions to see how in the short term maybe there could be some drift?
Yeah, that's a good question. So this is data that was collected continuously over 6 months, I think starting in about August to the end of the year. So the goal actually was to get this to coincide around elections. So you had the 2018 midterms, you had the 2020 election. I think it would be interesting to potentially subdivide this at like really tight intervals, like right before the election day, or right before and after a breaking news event, like, I don't know, Trump does something bombastic or whatever. And maybe you would see a more localized effect.
Right, and just one more thing. Also, do you model time correlations? In other words, you see what I mean by time correlations, not between 18 and 20, but like I get some search results back. I make my decision, I start engaging, then I do another search, I get some search back, and so on and so forth. So the results that you are showing here are basically the averages across the whole window, but there is no time correlation. I'm just wondering whether if you could see, maybe then I go to sleep and then I wake up the next morning and I'm again my same self. But during my web browsing experience for like an hour, perhaps there could be something. I mean, these are good results. I actually like it. It's positive. There's no bad. I was just wondering, So there's no time correlation, is my understanding, right? You look at them, all of them, you get an average. Okay.
Yeah, I don't think we did. There are other studies where we have done that, and I'm blanking on which one. Sometimes we refer to that as like a search trail. You're looking at kind of a session, an activity through a very short kind of directed information seeking time. And yeah, you're looking for like, does the partisanship increase through the session? But I don't think we did that here. Let's do Athena.
All right, Zuberi was before, but my question is directly related to Kostas. So I agree with the time aspect, because this looks to me, it's not an open loop system, it's a control loop. So you add a little bit of separation in the Google search exposure, and that feeds back, and it drives the system towards spreading more apart. So do you know of any work that has modeled that that effect as a control system? You can imagine asking questions like how much is okay to separate at the Google search exposure so that the result is not too polarized, or maybe it's quantifiable.
Yeah, so we do a little bit of this in the next study I'm going to talk about on YouTube rabbit holing. I don't think anyone's ever done this with the Google results, though.
And you're not aware of modeling works that have looked at that? I'm not, so I'm just curious.
Yeah, if there is, it's probably on Twitter data, because that's just like where the bulk of everything kind of happens because of data availability. Almost certainly not on Google. People just don't have good data like this. Yeah, Zabir.
Do we have time? Because I can hold on until later if you have more stuff to cover. I mean,
no, go for it.
Okay, I just want to focus on the top left result. And I see that you are suggesting that this difference really is not meaningful. When we have done this kind of like work in our research, mainly using sock puppets and not using real users, we also see smaller differences. But when I've really looked at the differences like qualitatively and see like why the difference is not that big, I've realized that when you, for example, two people search the exact same thing, a bulk of the results are fluff, like they are generic, popular results. So if you look at the differences and you don't eliminate overlapping results and focus on the differences and only consider the different results in computing average news partisanship, you are essentially minimizing the differences. So if you focus on the differences, you will find bigger differences. So I wonder if it was a little bit of an intentional choice on your part to include all search results here.
Yeah, I think it is. I would say if the focus of the study is like really to drill into just the personalization, like are there any differences in the output of the algorithm that can be attributed to a personalized decision as opposed to like just noise, then yes, I agree. There's a lot of fluff. Like every single one is a link to Wikipedia. But if we're trying to look at the human behavior, I don't think it's reasonable to get rid of the fluff, because that's not how people consume the SERP. We do a lot of modeling of attention here, of like the top result is most important, and there's this decay in attention. If those strong differences are at the very bottom, yeah, the algorithm did something, but like the practical relevance of that is very low.
Thank you.
So, again, happy to talk more about that study, but today I'm trying to do this kind of very rapid overview. So I'd like to move on to the next study, which is on YouTube. So you have probably heard, that YouTube has been accused of being the great radicalizer. The question for us was, is that really true? Again, this is a case where there wasn't a lot of evidence one way or the other over time. And now there is kind of this emerging literature about it. And the literature doesn't always agree. So, I just told you about this Google study where we recruited people in 2020. Well, we didn't just collect data about Google usage. We also collected data about YouTube usage. So this is focusing on this 2020 cohort. It's expanded a little bit now. We got about 1,000 people. Again, we have a survey. We know about the people. They install a browser extension. We get their browsing history. But instead of focusing on the Google snapshots, let's now focus on the YouTube snapshots. So we have all the pages that YouTube showed them, including watch pages and all the recommendations in the right-hand rail. So based on that data set, we want to understand, are people being driven into these kind of radical rabbit holes? To do that, we rely on a couple of curated lists. So one of them is a list of alternative and extreme YouTube channels. So this is things that range from like Steven Crowder, sort of the alt-right, literally to David Duke, like a grand dragon of the Ku Klux Klan who had a YouTube channel for many, many, many years. We also have a list of mainstream news channels. This is exactly who you expect, right? The CNN channel, things like that. So what are we getting from YouTube? All right, we get what video is being watched, obviously, and the metadata about it, like the title. We have whether the person who viewed it was subscribed to the channel, which ends up being really important. We have all the recommendations, right? So this is a rank ordered list. The top one is typically autoplay. And again, for all of these, we know which video it was and its metadata, like the title, the channel, social engagement, all that stuff. So let's start with like the very high level picture here. So this is just showing how much alternative and videos from alternative and extremist channels were viewed overall by the cohort. In general, those numbers are very low. There's just not a ton of engagement with those channels. Now, that's not entirely surprising, right? If you look at mainstream media consumption, that's only about 5.8% of the videos overall. YouTube is very much not for politics and news. It's for cat videos, Cocomelon, game streams. Like that is predominantly why people are on YouTube. But let's drill in a little further. So these are the distributions of recommendations that people were shown when they were viewing different kinds of stuff. So on the far left, you have the distribution of recommendations when they were viewing a video from an alternative channel. Next to that, you have recommendations when they were viewing a video in an extreme channel. Then you got mainstream media, and you got everywhere else. So, starting on the right, actually, when people are just viewing kind of random stuff on YouTube, there's some small proportion of recommendations to mainstream news, and there's a teeny tiny set of recommendations to alternative content. But in general, that's not really a thing. Now, focusing over on the left, yeah, there is actually a significant fraction of recommendations to alternative channels when you're watching something from an alternative channel, and a fairly high degree of recommendations to alternative and extreme channels when you're watching something from an extreme channel. So there is a fair amount of homophily. But again, you're already watching something that's sort of objectionable at that point. So to put those numbers in greater context, around 50% of all the recommendations to the videos from alternative and extreme channels were presented to people who were already subscribed to those channels. And then about 75% of the clicks on those recommendations to a video from an alternative or extreme channel are made by subscribers. So, there's a bunch of interesting things happening here. People assume that the YouTube recommender is like a really sophisticated system. It's actually not that sophisticated. The majority of recommendations are to stuff that you already subscribe to. They're just sending you back to the places they know you like. At YouTube, they don't even call those recommendations really. So we talked to them after we published this study, and there was a lot of interesting sort of semantic discussion about like, what is a recommendation? When they show you a recommendation to something that you subscribe to them, that's not even a recommendation. So again, right, there's a lot of homophily here, and that increases even more when we talk about just engagement with that content. So let's get back to this rabbit hole hypothesis. Right? The idea is that an average person is being shown something, they start watching a video about cats, but then they're shown a recommendation to something that's really objectionable. They watch that, and then they continue to escalate and get to more and more extreme content. Do we actually see that happening in our data? So if we just look at the percentage of cases where a participant followed a recommendation to an alternative or an extreme channel, that's only 0.16% of video visits, and that only occurred to 6% of participants. But this criteria is not really strict enough. And so let's make this a little bit more restrictive. You followed that recommendation, and it had to move you from content that was less extreme to more extreme. Well, that cuts the numbers down. That's only 0.08% of video visits, and that only happened to 4.5% of all the participants in the pool. But even this isn't quite restrictive enough. Right? We also have to take into account subscriptions. Right? So if you're already subscribed to that channel, the extreme channel or the alternative channel, right, that doesn't count. So if we throw that stuff out, now we're down to 0.02% of the video visits to only 3.8% of the participants. Even that isn't quite restrictive enough, right? Let's throw out all the cases where you were subscribed to any alternative or any extreme channel. Well, that really winnows it down. Now we're down to 0.01% of video visits and 2.8% of the participants overall. Yeah, Zubir.
So I'm going to, I think, push back a little bit of how you are characterizing this reduction and trying to minimize this 2.8% or 3 point whatever. Mm-hmm. I mean, YouTube has 2 billion users.
Yep.
2.8% of this billion is also millions of users. So if, for example, if we have a product that is killing 3% of its people, I just not a big fan of how you're kind of like saying this is nothing.
I agree. And we frame it this way in the paper. So I apologize for being a bit glib as I'm presenting today. You're absolutely right. It's a huge system. And even if this is only happening to 2 or 3% of people, that's a lot of people. There are other caveats to this study. So this is all 2020 data. And in 2019, YouTube said there was a massive overhaul to moderate down recommendations to what they call borderline content. So it may absolutely be true that in 2016, when a lot of these accusations first emerged, things were much worse. So there's maybe a mixed message here. We don't know how bad things were. Maybe they've gotten better. Are they good enough? As you're saying, right, there's still cause for concern here.
Yeah, I think my point is really, for example, in security, there is this notion of base rate.
Yeah.
And I think when social scientists, they characterize these results, I've seen them talk about, oh, this is only 1%, 2%, 3%. The algorithm is not the problem. Then in security, we care about the base rate. For example, when you're thinking about false positives, if you apply the same principle here, like this 2% is huge. It's extremely important. It is actually not negligible unless it is like 0.01 or something like that. Essentially minimizing this, I feel like, is a disservice to the debate.
Fair. Yeah, Kostas.
So I have a question about number 2. Because it's exactly half of the video visits. So the two characters, so the classifier had either from less extreme to more extreme or from more extreme to less extreme. Because if this is the case, it appears that it's a random choice. It's 50-50, which is good, actually. It's even better than it looks. Were just these the two options, or there was also something like similarly extreme?
Yeah, there's a third option, which is equivalent sort of movements.
Okay. So then there is definitely a bias in this case, right? In the sense that ideally you would have a random, because I think that the most important thing is going from 1 to 2. After that, I actually agree with the argument. If you are already subscribed, it's like you are getting stuff from the channel you have already subscribed. It's not the algorithm.
Yeah.
But from 1 to 2, I don't know what are the numbers of the other two. Let's say it's 25%, 25%, 50%. Essentially, going from 1 to 2 says that the algorithm 50% of the time pushes you to be more extreme, right? So X% of the time pushes you to be less extreme. And you know what I mean, right? And the remaining, it would ideally be 50-50, right? That's just my...
Yeah. Let's see. Athena, are we over at 1?
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe I'll skip through the unfair hiring stuff and we can just conclude and discuss. Okay, so very briefly, you can take me with a grain of salt because I claim to be an auditor, but I think this kind of work is crucial. As we've seen just in the discussion right here, some of these problems that we theorize may occur, like filter bubbles, are perhaps overblown. Others, like radicalization on YouTube, right? The situation is complex, shall we say. We've done other studies looking at things like anti-conservative bias and censorship, looking at YouTube, right? Like we don't see it. And yet that's something that Congress has held many sessions to try and accuse tech executives of committing this kind of bias. That said, right, some of the problems that people say are problems are very much problems. Even setting aside recommendations on YouTube for a moment, right, there is a wide availability of problematic and hateful content. I can tell you stories that are really troubling about YouTube. They're a host for this, and that is a problem. They're enabling a community that has engaged in violence like January 6th. I didn't get to talk about it, but we have seen things like unfair biases on recruiting platforms. So not every theorized problem is real, but some of them are definitely real. And I think auditing is really crucial to uncovering the differences. Ultimately, what we want is accountability, right? We want systems that serve people, don't cause harm to society. I think a lot of that starts with transparency. If you can bring these things to light, you can take it to the press, right? You can engage in a public pressure campaign. You can talk about regulatory invention. This is not going to be surprising to this group. You guys do responsible disclosure, you name and shame. We all know how this goes. Clearly, things are changing and not necessarily for the better. I think we all have very legitimate concerns about the proliferation of large language models, how they're getting integrated in different kinds of contexts where they can cause a variety of harms. They're extremely non-transparent. There's a lot of reasons for concern around this technology. One of the things I've learned through the course of doing all this auditing work is that it's hard. And we really need more people to engage in this kind of work. So, consider these Google and YouTube studies that I just talked about. They cost well over $100,000 each. Probably closer to $200,000, right? There was custom software development for the browser extensions. This consumed a grad student's life for a year. The extensive legal reviews with OGC, IRB. We went through all of this. We paid $100,000 to a survey provider to get us this sample. And even then, we're still only talking about a couple hundred, maybe 1,000 people. So these are relatively small samples. Ultimately, we got some nice papers out of this, but none of you can replicate it or build on it because I can't share the data with you. So, these projects are sort of dead ends. If we think this is important, and I think we would agree that it is, we need to eliminate these kinds of barriers. It shouldn't cost this much. It shouldn't require this much work to get this kind of rich data and do these kinds of studies. So this is why Dave, in his copious free time as a PI on every grant in existence, and I are working on something called the National Internet Observatory. So this is a platform for large-scale web and mobile-based data collection about human behavior and platform behavior. So we are recruiting thousands, hopefully tens of thousands of US residents. We're going to be periodically surveying them. And then we give them browser extensions and apps to collect this kind of online trace data. So what do they browse? What do they search? What do they click? What do they watch? What do they see? I'm really proud of our consent and education procedures here. I think the way we're going about data collection is highly ethical. And the upshot for all of you is that this is an infrastructure project. There's $0 for us to do any work with this data. It's meant to be a resource for the community. So hopefully early next year, we'll be opening the doors. You can apply for access to this data. The goal is to take something like that Google study or that YouTube study that took years and hundreds of thousands of dollars and make that a semester project for a grad student. Like, you should just be able to replicate that work and extend it very, very easily using the observatory's data. Yeah, we are live in the field. If anyone's interested, right, nationalinternetobservatory.org. If you want to volunteer, you can. But also, as I said, hopefully the data will start being available early next year. Just a thank you to all of my collaborators on all this work. Too many to name. And yeah,